So, next up is our talker. Now, our talkers don't get paid, they come for free. So Mark has come from Liverpool, from London today. It would have been nicer if you'd have come from Liverpool. So he's come today. Our talkers, the people that put this together, we don't get paid. We do it because we love testing, we love our trade. And we have a real passion for that, and that's what drives this event. So here we can see Mark with the perfect parting. Have you noticed that? Please feel free to make comments about that during the night. Sorry, Mark. And here we can see Mark doing a 99-second talk at Test Bash. Was that last year or the year before?
That was this year.
Right, okay.
Yeah, and that's Dan Ashby who's keynoting it.
And Dan Ashby is, I think, talking in November for us. I think. Maybe. So there's a coup for us. And yes, and you've also done a masterclass on Ministry of Testing.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes, around regression checking.
Okay. So enough of me talking about Mark. Let's get Mark up here so he can do his bloody talk. Round of applause for Mark, please. Put it somewhere comfortable for you. All right, sure.
Okay, so we've got a few clicker problems, so I'm going to very subtly ask Duncan to change each slide for me. So yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, it's awesome to be here. This is a great place, lovely weather. Brought the sunshine up from London for you. How to lose your crowd in 5 minutes.
I said bring humour into it.
It's humorous to me. That's all that matters. Yes, so welcome to my talk. Say TATTA to your TUTTU. Anti-patterns in automation. You guys are a little bit of a guinea pig crowd. This is a new talk, but this is sort of based on a blog post that I did recently. Next slide, please, Duncan. Super subtle. There we go. So yes, you've seen a little bit about me. I'm Mark. I have great hair, apparently, which is really disconcerting that people keep bringing that up. But more importantly, I am a test manager for AstraZeneca. Although I've just moved into that role, I spent sort of 5 years as a contractor, as a technical tester, focusing on test automation. I'm very passionate about doing automation in a good way that actually delivers value rather than, like we were saying before, just following the typical models that are out there. So I blog a bit about that on my site, on MW Test Consultancy. I'm on Twitter, 2-Bit Tester, so I'm always up for talking. And if you use LinkedIn, I'm there as well. I also co-run the software testing clinic with Dan down in London, but we're maybe hopefully in the future looking to branch out. So, maybe get something set up in Manchester/Liverpool, where we teach testers who are new to testing or want to get into testing, teach them about that and offer opportunities to mentors. So if you're interested in just hearing about that and, it's something that you might want to get involved in the future, come give me a shout afterwards. Or people online, send messages. Twitter, send messages. Cool. Next slide, please. Okay, so this talk is about anti-patterns. It's about test automation. It's about mnemonics and heuristics, and it's about models. So I'd like to sort of find out, because the first person I spoke to here tonight actually does games testing. So I was a little bit like, oh God, this isn't massively relevant. Who here is involved in sort of test automation specifically around sort of web-based stuff? Hands up. Oh, good, it is relevant. That said, it is, it's about test automation, but it's also about test design and thinking about your test design. Next slide. Cool. So, as you might have guessed, TATTA to your TUTTU, it's two mnemonics that I use to help me avoid anti-patterns in my testing. So, the next slide. So let's talk about TUTTU first. So, for example, we've got here a very simple WebDriver script. I've written in Java, but basically we instantiate our driver, we go to a site, we fill in a form, first name, last name, we submit it, and then down here at the bottom, we get the title and we assert what the title is. So we're basically sort of saying, I've submitted it and I've gone to another page, okay? So We've got this check, because I believe that they are checks, they're not regression tests. I'm not going to get into that now. Come find me later if you want to talk about that, checking versus testing. But you've got this check in place, and you're running this in grid. You run this across, multiple VMs. You're running this across lots of different browsers. So this is where we start running into our anti-pattern. Do the next slide. If you want to, there's 3 entries, just click through them real quick. Otherwise, I'm going to be shouting at you all night. Okay, so 3 anti-patterns that I sort of identified here. The first one being checking the, so say for example, with the check that we've got, there are different things that we could potentially be checking with that script. So the first would be that we're just making sure that the form renders in the browser, okay? And it renders in the browser across multiple different browsers, and it can be filled in by different humans. Different humans? Well, yes, different humans, why not? So you would hope it would be different humans, otherwise your application hasn't really succeeded if it's one human. Tangent. Okay, so one of the issues with having a script like this that runs across different browsers is we have to sort of consider what it is that WebDriver actually does for us and what we mean by rendering. So WebDriver is a great tool, and I use it a lot, along with other tools, I should say. But what WebDriver does is it allows us to access the DOM inside our browser, okay? So that means that we can query the DOM to see if the HTML that we want to fill in our form and submit that button, we can use that to query the DOM to see if that's there. It's not necessary, but that's not the same as actually loading the browser up and looking at the browser and seeing your form in there. Because it might be CSS issues, it might be other blocks sitting on top of it and stuff. So if the question is about, if you can't actually confirm how it actually looks as a human would look at it, and you're only pulling the stuff from the DOM, essentially what you're doing, if you're running that script across multiple browsers, you're just basically querying the DOM from each of those browsers to say, is that HTML there? So then the point of that is that actually you're not really testing what the browser's doing with the HTML. You're actually testing what the back end is sending to you. So it might be better to actually do an API level check to make sure that the HTML is coming out. Because if a browser is not going to be able to render a simple form, in this example, disco lights, all right. Oh, we're getting intimate. If a browser can't render basic HTML, then that browser is useless and no one's going to use it, so there's no point in testing it. So that's the first anti-pattern. The second is that maybe you're actually checking that the browser takes you to the same page after submission. So the assumption here is that each browser, different browsers, can actually handle your redirect in a different way. But again, if one browser handled a redirect completely different to other browsers, no one would use it. And actually, again, the instructions are being sent to the browser from the back end again. So again, another type of API check could be put in place to say, do I get a redirect code and where is it sending me to go to? Third, there's checking that each browser is using JavaScript correctly to create the form. So for example, if it's a pop-up, okay, and the pop-up is actually being generated on the fly by JavaScript, then yes, absolutely, you'd want to check that in different browsers. Browsers do have different JavaScript engines. But why are you submitting it? Why are you still checking that it's going to another page? Because you're still doing the same thing as you're doing in the second anti-pattern, in that the back end is actually informing you where to go. Okay? So there are 3 different types of anti-patterns that I think that we do quite a lot actually. There's always this sort of drive to sort of say, we need to write all our checks, and then we need to, in WebDriver, and then we need to run them across different browsers. But what you're doing is actually maybe a little bit of a redundancy, maybe a lot of duplication. So again, so this is where I use this mnemonic. So when I was sort of talking about where you could do this on the API, how do you know when to do it on the API level and when to do it, when to actually be testing the UI? So I use the mnemonic testing the UI or testing through the UI. So TUTTU. So when I'm writing my checks, when I'm putting my frameworks together, and even if I'm doing my exploratory testing, if I'm totally honest, I'm thinking about what am I testing? Am I testing something that's actually actionable inside the browser? Or am I testing something that's actionable by the back end? Because focused automated tools, I've been banding this idea around about the idea of sort of micro frameworks. So rather than having one big monolithic framework that runs all your checks for you, having lots of small frameworks that target, so for example, you could have one that does just JavaScript checking, but doesn't care what's going on in the back end. You could have one that does back end testing, but doesn't care what's going on in the front end. You could have another one that then sort of says, well, those two are passing, but maybe we should just do some smoke testing to make sure that they talk to one another. It's about sort of building up like a trust model between them. So I will use this mnemonic to come up with that. Pow pow. Okay, that looks horrible. I was slightly concerned that might not come out well. Okay, so ways in which we could solve that anti-pattern. So with those anti-patterns that I was talking about before, I'm testing through the UI. I'm not testing the UI. So if I'm testing through the UI, why not just get rid of it? Why not just focus on what's going in the back end? So can't really see here, but this is some screenshots of Postman, and we're sending a post to the form endpoint with a payload of first name and last name. So I'm sending exactly the same data. But then I've got a test item here to say, assert that my status code is a redirect, so a 300, a 302, a 304. And then I'm also saying that the response header location is actually is sending the information, go to this next page. And you could actually extend this and say, well, there are times when, depending on the browser, so if it's a mobile browser versus a desktop browser, I want to go to a different page. You could change the user agent, but you still don't have to do everything through the UI. So you run that will be much quicker, much more robust than having to do something through WebDriver, which has to turn it on, has to go through all the login process and stuff. You could add all your cookies in, and you end up with something that's much quicker. So another way we can do this, that one more. If we go for the next slide, you might see. So this is another way of doing it. So anyone familiar with Rest Assured? Hands up. No? Okay. Well, Rest Assured is a library for Java, which allows you to do similar stuff that you do in Postman, but just in code. But it's the same thing. So I set some parameters, I set my payload, I post it to an endpoint, and then I go, have I got status code 304, and does my header equal to my location header? So you're all getting a little sleepy. Let's go for the next slide. So I was told participation is good. So with that in mind, I've come up with 5 different scenarios, and I want to find out what you guys think. Is this testing through the UI or testing the UI? So for example, we're checking validation is triggered on the form before submission. So hands up for testing the UI. You think you're actually testing the UI? Okay. And who thinks it's testing through the UI? Okay. So the answer, I guess, would be it kind of depends. So if this was JavaScript, I would say it's testing the UI. And when I came up with this, I was thinking of JavaScript. So it would be testing the UI. But if you were having your validation was actually being sent, submitted into your back end and sending some information back to your front end, it'd be testing through the UI. Should we move to the next one? I'm not doing the guns anymore. Okay, checking a record is created in the database on form submission. Testing the UI, hands up. Oh, you're getting good. Testing through the UI. There we go, yes, exactly. Cool, next one.
Sorry, why is that one testing through the UI, Mark?
Well, because we're storing, so for people who might not have heard, on the internet, why is that testing through the UI? So essentially what we're doing is we're sending some information that's, the action actually is being stored in the database, is being handled by the back end. So we could, again, do it on the API level, send some information and then assert that that record's been stored in the back end. Okay, checking, oh, no, back one. Oh, did you?
No, I went back.
Oh, you did? Oh, God. Okay, so checking an edit version of the form contains previous values. Are we testing the UI? Ooh, so there's like E, why do you think E?
It depends what it's, where it's stored the values and where it's getting it back from. So maybe it's testing through UI, which means
Okay.
but the UI itself is holding.
Yeah, so where it's storing the value. So absolutely, if it was JavaScript and it was all being saved in a session, then it would be testing the UI. Testing through the UI. Okay, so yeah, there's some real asserted hands coming up now. Yes. Yeah, so when I was thinking of this, I was testing through the UI because I'm calling a record from the back end and it's going to send me back either a payload with the information to be injected into my edit form, or it's going to send me the HTML to build that edit form in the browser. And then I think we've got one more. So checking a pop-up appears when clicking a help icon next to a form field. Testing the UI. Oh, you've got it now, haven't you? Or testing through the UI. Ghost town. Exactly. So pop-ups tend to be JavaScript based. You might have some information being fed into that pop-up via like an Ajax call, but for this example, yeah, we're looking at testing the UI. So just those basic scenarios, you're using that mnemonic to come up with that heuristic to ask yourself what it is you're exactly testing will result in robust, well, more robust, hopefully more robust automation, but also as well, you can apply this to your exploratory testing as well. And this is where sort of models come in, is that if you think, well, actually I'm focusing on data that's going through the UI, maybe I don't need the UI at all, and I could just capture the HTTP request and use something like Postman, start sending information through. Okay, so moving on, pow pow. Oh, we got one more. Ah, I forgot about this one. So checking the form uploads an attached PDF correctly. Are we testing the UI? Are we testing through the UI? Yeah, you see, testing through the UI. So it's a tricky one because, and it's the one that catches out a lot of sort of people working with sort of WebDriver, is that because it's inaccessible. It's a PDF, but it's inaccessible. So you can either do some visual checking and use something like Applitools or Wraith to sort of do a visual compare, but you can actually also check based on its hash, its MD5 hash. If that doesn't change, then the file hasn't changed. Okay, I think that was the last one. So given that TUTTU is testing the UI, testing through the UI, can anyone have a guess at what maybe TATTA might be? Beautiful. Yes, testing the API, testing through the API. So moving on. So let's say we've taken that WebDriver script and we've slightly changed it now. We're interested in just saying, well, we'll store some information and we get 200 back. Okay. So we're using the rest assured setup again. We're sending the parameters, post it to the endpoint, we get 200 back. So we've run into another anti-pattern here. So we go to the next slide. So this is an image that I pinched from a blog site, which I think is fantastic, is that when people talk about API testing, they sometimes get stuck on the like the gateway to a service or the gateway to an object, because APIs are in various levels. And what I always sort of think, so I run a course called Testing Web Services. I don't call it Testing APIs because I believe that, I might be technically wrong, but I believe that APIs are a programmatical way to show intent. Like, this is what we intend something to do. But you've still got the actual inner workings with inside those methods or inside those services. So for example, here we have, for something like, an edit form that's going in, that's hitting some middleware, then it's hitting a router, which routes it to some other custom-made code, which then comes back to a renderer, and that comes back here and comes out as an HTML page. So bringing that back to the anti-pattern, which I must say got horribly burnt once. Next slide. He's just tapping away on his phone.
Picking you up.
Oh, okay. Once I was involved in a project where I did some of this stuff and I moved a bunch of stuff to the API, and I went, basically we had to cover every endpoint with at least one test to say we're getting a 200, so that any changes we made, we didn't get a 500. All my checks passed. Then I noticed I was getting a 200 with a body saying an error hasn't occurred. So I updated my assertion to say, check if the body has an error occurred, and half of my test suite failed. Okay, so the anti-pattern was just to assume that just because I was getting an okay via the status code, because the API was working and saying, yeah, it's all fine, but something was going wrong internally. I'm less animated with the guns now. Flagging. Okay, so yeah, testing the API or testing through the API. Am I checking that I can access my service, or am I actually using the API to get into somewhere inside the application? Am I getting into those middleware bits that I was talking about? So next slide. So I might want to update, as I said, I might update it so that I'd add an extra line in to say, check my body, not my body. That's such a bad joke. I'm sorry, internet. But check that basically the HTML I'm getting back is not, even though I'm getting a status code, I'm not getting back an error has occurred. I'm actually getting some values back. So I hear about a lot of people who are like, yeah, we've got full coverage of our API because we've got one check for each of them to say we've got 200. So you do realize there's other stuff going on in there. And what you can do is, because taking that idea of am I testing the API or am I testing through the API, if I'm storing something and I'm getting an error occurred, it's not the API that's erroring, maybe it's something further low leveled. So we go to the next slide. You can't see anything. Am I allowed to swear on the internet? This is a Postman version of this, just to sort of keep it thing. But if we move to the next slide, is that actually I could probably write what I was writing on that API thing as a unit check. And I could go to my developer, or I'd be sitting with my developer, pairing with my developer, and say, well, let's just put a check in to say, if I put those values in and set them to the create new record object, just assert that I'm actually I'm not getting an error out of it. So what we've done is we've taken a WebDriver check up on the UI that was taking, I don't know, let's say 30 seconds, 20, 30 seconds to load. Maybe that's being a little bit over the top. But we've pushed down, using these two mnemonics, we've focused down, we've pushed down this check, this test, into targeting the specific area that you're checking. So there's an interesting talk that I saw a couple of months back by J.B. Rainsberger, which is Integration Testing is a Scam. I highly recommend you all watch it, because it's fantastic. Yeah, +1 over there. So seconded, you have to. Isn't that the law of gatherings? If someone seconds it, you have to go and watch the video. But it's a very interesting video, which is, basically, when you're up on your UI level, you're still testing this little bit here, but what you're doing is you're going through a bunch of integrations. So if you can cut out those integrations and test this part, then you're actually getting a faster test, probably reducing the amount of checks that you have in place as well. Because as soon as you start introducing more integration points, the amount of checks proliferate. But you end up with something a lot more targeted and faster and more robust.
Are you saying that those integration tests aren't needed?
No, I'm saying that they aren't integration tests in the first place. So I'm saying that you are testing this rather than actually focusing on the integration. Sorry, so the question was, are the integration checks not needed? The point being is that if you can push a bunch of this stuff into unit checking, then what you realize is the only risks that you're not covering are your integrations, and you can have a subset of integrations. So when I think of smoke tests are exactly that. Smoke one end, smoke out the other end. They're not what tends to happen, which is they're actually testing that the features work and stuff. They shouldn't be for that. They should be the icing on the cake that's sort of saying, well, all the other checks have passed, blowing smoke through it, it all connects together, so it should be fine. So
we've got a question for us?
Yeah, go for it.
So is this basically your way of saying that we avoid the fallacy of testing the parts as the thing as testing the sum? Basically, we're testing the units, and we avoid going, oh well, if the units work, clearly they all work together. We test them individually.
How to phrase your question for the internet?
Sorry.
So we're saying that, are you saying, so if we've got all these unit checks in place, we don't need to do any other testing? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying, is this your suggested method for avoiding?
Okay, so my suggested method is that it's all about targeting specific risks or targeting specific things that I want to test. Yeah, a test is to test a risk, I suppose. So this is focusing on one type of risk, and this is focusing on that I can create a new record. Okay, so I will focus that on specifically on the method that does that. But then there is another risk that cannot be reached by the UI, and that would be a second check. So yeah, I think we're in agreement. Yeah. Okay, so we did some TUTTUs. Let's do some TATTAs. So checking a third-party web service can be accessed. Are you testing the API or testing through the API? Testing the API, hands up. Testing through the API. It's not nice when you're the only person who puts a hand up in a room, isn't it? I would say it's testing the API because you're not, it's the typical rule of that if you're using a third-party application, it's about sort of domain and who's responsible for what domain. So, you want to make sure that you can access that third-party application, third-party API to pull in relevant data, but you might not want to be testing what's going on in the internals of that API. Okay, next one. Checking a web service evaluates data and returns a result. Are we testing the API or testing through the API? Testing the API. Few. Testing through the API. A lot more. So interested, testing the API, guys, why? Why would you say that?
You're only checking that it returns the results.
Okay, so you're only checking that it returns the results. So that might be a phrasing. I'd say that you could interpret it that way. I would say it's testing through the API because I'm actually, what's being hidden behind that is that there is something behind that API or in that API that is evaluating the data and returning the results for me. But the fact that it's, returning it would, it implies response back. So yeah, I think that's a good argument against it. So also, there is no hard and fast rule with these mnemonics. They're heuristics, they're flawed, they mean something to you, they're your interpretations. Let's go for the next one. Checking a web service returns a record in the correct structure. Are we testing the API or testing through the API? Testing the API? Testing through the API. Yeah, it's a bit trickier, this one. Yeah, there's a few people like, it depends where it's happening, I suppose. But again, I personally feel that this would be testing, I can't remember which one I set this for, actually. Stumped, hoisted by my own petard. yeah, it depends where the translation, like, so if it's a, say for example, a Java object that's been turned into JSON, is it the middleware that's doing it? Then maybe it's the API. If you're actually building a model and then sending that through and actually turning that into JSON, for example, like actively turning that into JSON and then sending that out, then maybe you're testing through the API. So sometimes as well, these can generate questions. So they might not generate tests or checks, but they might generate questions to go and ask your developers. Like, where is this actually happening? Where is this change from X to Y occurring? Go for one more? I think two more, actually. Checking a web service handles overflow data, such as an integer. Are you testing the API? Are you testing through the API? Okay, I've clearly lost half the room because some of those hands didn't come up. I know that for a fact. It's all those comments about bringing the sunshine from the south, isn't it? Being punished. I'd say it's testing through the API because you're overflowing. You're buffer overflowing like some sort of data type inside the application. I think we've got one more, maybe? Okay, checking a redirect is returned after an unauthorized request is made. Are you testing the API? Testing through the API. Some puzzled faces. I like this, it's good, get you thinking. So I'd say this is testing the API because security sort of layers tend to be on the middleware. So I'm thinking of things like Apache Interceptor. So they're plugins that you'll drop into your application rather than like actual code base that you can test. That makes sense. Okay, I think that's it. Next slide. Yeah, any questions? Yes?
When you're doing the TUTTU testing the API instead of the UI, how do you handle things like CSRF tokens and view state workflows?
Okay, so the issue is authentication, isn't it? So, sorry?
View state in .NET, ASP.NET Web Forms.
Okay, I'm not aware of view states. I am going to be aware that that's the project I'm working on, that's coming in, but so why would you think it wouldn't work with you? Like, what would you say the problem is with view states?
Essentially encodes some of the program state into the actual HTML on the page.
Okay.
And then sends it back to the server.
Oh, okay, okay. So we're talking about sort of making requests that rely on previous state, yeah? So personally, I would just have there's always going to be a point of origin, okay? So that code's going to be generated. So an example I give is I was working with a social media tool that every time you wanted to create some content to stop like CRF issues, it would drop a token into the create page. So what I would do is I would do a request to get the create page, then do a lookup in the HTML, grab my tokens, stick them in. So analyze your payload, look at what's going on in your payload, what's being sent through, what's required, and yeah, go grab that stuff. There's nothing to say you can't do 3 HTTP requests before it to grab it. Fact is, it's still going to be quite quick to do that sort of stuff because there's no browser loading it, there's no rendering of all this sort of stuff. You're only pulling in the HTML. It does get trickier though if, say for example, tokens and stuff are generated by JavaScript. Then you do have to start looking at maybe you do need to do WebDriver stuff. Cool?
Yeah, cool.
Excellent. Question 1 answered. Get in. Any more? Yes?
When you're saying testing the API and testing through the API, how do you make a distinction about when you want to make a test that's literally just for testing through or testing the API? Because surely for a lot of cases it's quite easy to write a test and test both at the same time, because if you're testing the response and the content, you're testing the API and you're testing through the API in one test. So the idea is, and I think it's a wider argument about you could actually test a lot of things in one automated script. I think the issue there is that there's more scope to brilliance. That's one thing. I think on an API level as well is that if you're doing that, you could absolutely do that, and you could you could kill a few birds with one stone. But it is kind of highly dependent. Is it actually faster?
Okay? So if you're running more things in one test, that test is going to take longer. And if you're higher up, there's no denying it's going to take longer. So there's a proliferation of time there. The other factor is as well, is that if something fails, it's harder to diagnose what's failed. Okay? So if you're doing a bunch of stuff on the API level and you get an error has occurred. So going back to my example earlier, we did that. We looked at the response code and we looked at the body. But if I wanted to find out more information, an error has occurred. Well, what's actually broken? Whereas if I have a unit check in place, if that unit check is purely targeted on that method, if I get an error from that, I know it's that method that's wrong. Because it's all about, the reason why we have automation is to have rapid feedback on what's changing in the application as you make changes. Which I think if Bradshaw's watching, he knows that I'm ripping him off right now. But that's the point, is that you want that rapid feedback. So you want to know straight away what's broken. Because it's the same thing as like when you raise a bug and a developer goes, well, I need more information, I need stack overflows and stuff like that. Because if you say, I press the button, something broke, and they're like, well, anything from there to there could have broken. And I really don't want to spend all my day working that all out. So it's about fast feedback, it's about, being friendly to your developer as well, so that they're more receptive, so they know what to fix straight away.
Okay.
Good.
One more question if we've got one.
Yes.
Okay. Do you think there's a risk that testers might think there's something special in middleware when actually it's part of the application logic?
The question just for the
Yeah, it's good, yeah. So a risk that something might be, you might perceive something to be in the middleware, but it might be in the application logic, other way around. Simple answer, go talk to your developer. They're not scary people, they're lovely, lovely people. They taught me all this stuff that I know. They're great guys and girls. So if you don't know, go ask. That is as simple as that. But it's a bit trickier if you're not aware of the fact that you're making that assumption. But that's why have these. That's why I came up with these mnemonics, to help you sort of trigger that thinking. Cool. I have one more.
Are you going to the pub after?
I am going to the pub after.
So, for those of you that are going to the pub after, which I hope there's quite a few, if you've got more questions for Mark, he's available during the break. He's here till the end of the evening, and he's also available in the pub as well. So your job isn't done yet, mate.
No, that's fair enough. I'd just say as well, if you are interested in learning more about this sort of stuff, I am doing testing web services class up in Manchester in September through the Ministry of Testing as a Master of the Ministry. Do you want to change the slide? So yeah, some dates. And I'm also running a workshop with Richard Bradshaw, Friendly Tester, where we're going to look into what we've talked about here. We're going to do it in depth, which is sort of taking automated checking beyond WebDriver, where we will give you a suite of checks and you will learn how to push those things down, and you'll learn loads of new tools and stuff.
Is that getting streamed anywhere?
No. And it's paid.
Okay, so can we have a round of applause for Mark?
Thank you guys.